When the gods divided the earth among themselves, Enki took the waters of the deep, Enlil commanded the winds and storms, and between the divine brothers, rivalry was born that would shape the destiny of a race not yet created. From the Enuma Elish, circa 1900 BCE, Babylon. What if humanity's origin story is not metaphor but memory? What if the gods of ancient Sumer were not supernatural beings dwelling in celestial realms, but physical entities from another world? Could the creation myths etched into clay tablets 5,000 years ago be describing an act of deliberate biological engineering? The ancient Mesopotamians, dwelling between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq, left behind more than ruins and pottery shards. They left a written record, thousands upon thousands of cuneiform tablets, detailing not only their daily commerce and legal proceedings, but also their cosmology, their understanding of the universe, and most intriguingly, their account of humanity's origins. These texts speak of the Anunnaki, a term that translates as those who from heaven to earth came. Academic scholars interpret these beings as the pantheon of Sumerian deities, divine personifications of natural forces, symbolic representations of the human psyche's relationship with the cosmos. But there exists another interpretation, one far more controversial, one that suggests these tablets are not recording mythology but history. Before we proceed, a necessary acknowledgement. What follows are propositions that exist far outside mainstream academic consensus. These ideas challenge conventional archaeology, linguistics, astronomy, and biology. They have been rejected by the vast majority of scholars in relevant fields, yet they persist, discussed by millions, contemplated in documentaries and books, debated in forums across the world. As Aristotle wrote, it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. What we explore today demands precisely this intellectual openness, the capacity to consider radical propositions while maintaining critical discernment. Let us begin where the Sumerians began, with the tablets themselves. The cuneiform script, one of humanity's earliest writing systems, was deciphered in the 19th century, unlocking thousands of years of Mesopotamian literature. Among the most significant texts are the creation epics, the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis. The Enuma Elish, whose title means when on high, describes the generation of the gods from primordial waters, cosmic battles between deities, and the ordering of the universe. Within this epic, the Anunnaki appear not as a single god, but as a collective, a group of divine beings. The text states that after the god Marduk defeats the chaos goddess Tiamat, he organizes the cosmos and assigns duties to 600 Anunnaki, 300 stationed in heaven, 300 on earth. The Atrahasis, dating to approximately 1800 BCE, provides an even more detailed account of human origins. This epic begins not with the creation of humanity, but with a labor dispute among the gods themselves. According to the text, the lesser gods, called the Igigi, were forced to perform exhausting physical labor, digging rivers and canals for the senior gods, the Anunnaki. After 40 years, the text says, the Igigi rebelled. They burned their tools, marched to the dwelling of Enlil, the chief god, and refused to continue working. The Anunnaki Council convened to address this crisis. It is here that we encounter one of the most fascinating passages in ancient literature. The god Enki, known for his wisdom, proposes a solution. The text records his words preserved on tablets excavated from the ancient city of Sippar. Let the midwife of the gods create a worker. Let him bear the yoke, the work of Enlil. Let man assume the drudgery of the god. The goddess Nintu, also called Mami, the womb goddess, is summoned. What follows is a detailed description of a process. A specific god, We-Ilu, described as a god who possesses intelligence, is slaughtered. His blood is mixed with clay. The goddess Nintu takes this mixture and, with the assistance of other goddesses, fashions 14 beings, 7 male and 7 female. The text specifies that these beings inherit the intelligence of We-Ilu through his blood. They are created explicitly to work. To perform the labor, the Igigi refuse to continue. This is the Mesopotamian account of human creation, recorded not once but in multiple versions across centuries, in Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian sources. Mainstream scholarship interprets these narratives as theological texts, expressions of ancient Mesopotamian worldview, explanations for the human condition constructed through mythological framework. The clay represents the earth. The divine blood represents the sacred nature of human life. The labor theme reflects the agricultural reality of Mesopotamian civilization. These are myths that encode philosophical and social truths through symbolic narrative. This is the dominant academic position, supported by comparative mythology, anthropological theory, and literary analysis. But in 1976, a book was published that proposed an entirely different interpretation. The 12th Planet, written by Zecharia Sitchin, an Azerbaijani-born researcher who claimed expertise in ancient Hebrew and Sumerian languages, argued that these texts should be read not as mythology, but as historical documentation. Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki were not gods, but extraterrestrial beings, physically real entities from another planet who arrived on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago. According to Sitchin's interpretation of Mesopotamian texts, these beings came from a planet called Nibiru, a massive world following a highly elliptical orbit that brings it into the inner solar system once every 3,600 years. Sitchin claimed that Sumerian astronomical knowledge was far too advanced for a Bronze Age civilization, that their texts describe not just the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, but all the planets of the solar system, including Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, worlds not discovered by modern astronomy until the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries respectively. He interpreted certain cylinder seals, particularly one known as VA-243, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, as depicting the solar system with a sun surrounded by 11 celestial bodies, which he argued represented the 9 known planets, plus the moon, the sun counted as a body and Nibiru as the 12th. According to Sitchin's hypothesis, the Anunnaki initially came to Earth to mine gold, a metal they needed to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere by dispersing gold particles in the upper atmospheric layers. The mining operation, centered in southern Africa, was conducted by a labor force of Anunnaki workers. But approximately 300,000 years ago, these workers, like the Igigi in the myths, rebelled against the harsh conditions. The Anunnaki leadership, faced with this crisis, authorized a radical solution proposed by the chief scientist Enki. Using existing hominid species on Earth, Homo erectus, or perhaps early Homo heidelbergensis, Enki and the medical officer Ninmah conducted genetic experiments, combining Anunnaki DNA with indigenous hominid DNA to create a hybrid being capable of understanding and following complex instructions, a being strong enough to perform mining labor. This being was the Adamu, the model man, the prototype. According to this interpretation, the clay mentioned in the texts represents the biological material, the hominid egg or genetic substrate, and the divine blood represents the genetic contribution from the Anunnaki. The phrase, "let him bear the yoke," refers not to agricultural labor in a metaphorical sense, but to literal physical work in the mines. Sitchin pointed to the Hebrew word for man, Adam, which shares a root with Adama, meaning earth or ground, and connects this to the Akkadian Adamu. He argued that Genesis, the biblical creation account, is a later, condensed version of these earlier Mesopotamian texts, that Adam and Eve are Hebrew retellings of the Adamu creation story. The Nephilim mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, the sons of God who came down to the daughters of men, Sitchin identified as Anunnaki, who interacted with and bred with human females. This theory, known as the ancient astronaut hypothesis in its broader form, gained enormous popular following, spawning dozens of books, documentaries, and television series. It offers a framework that reinterprets not just Sumerian texts, but archaeological mysteries worldwide, from the precision of Egyptian pyramid construction to the massive stoneworks of Puma Punku in Bolivia to the Moai of Easter Island. But before we explore the evidence marshaled in support of these ideas, there is a critical detail we must examine later, a specific aspect of the genetic creation story that raises profound questions about the intent behind humanity's design, a detail that appears not in the heroic creation epics, but in a lesser-known text, one that discusses the limitations deliberately built into the human template. We will return to this when we discuss the forbidden knowledge. The conventional archaeological and anthropological understanding of human origins is based on extensive fossil evidence, genetic analysis, and the study of material culture. According to this framework, modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa approximately 300,000 years ago, evolving from earlier hominid species through natural selection. The key developments that distinguish humans from other primates, particularly our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, with whom we share approximately 98.8% of our DNA, are primarily neurological. The human brain, particularly the cerebral cortex, underwent significant expansion and reorganization. Genetic research has identified specific genes that changed rapidly in the human lineage after divergence from the common ancestor with chimpanzees approximately 6 to 7 million years ago. One of the most studied of these genes is HAR1, Human Accelerated Region 1, discovered in 2006 by a team led by Catherine Pollard at the University of California, Santa Cruz. This gene is active during a critical stage of embryonic brain development, specifically in caudal-reticular neurons, that guide the formation of the layered structure of the cerebral cortex. The remarkable feature of HAR1 is the rate of change. Across hundreds of millions of years of evolution, from chickens to chimpanzees, HAR1 remained almost unchanged, with only 2 base pair differences in a sequence of 118 bases. This stability indicates that HR1 performs an essential function and that any mutations would typically be detrimental. Yet between chimpanzees and humans, in just 5 to 7 million years, 18 changes occurred. Catherine Pollard stated, "We found 18 differences between chimps and humans, which is an incredible amount of change to have happened in a few million years. This is one of the fastest evolving sequences in the human genome. Conventional evolutionary biology attributes this to positive selection, intense environmental or social pressures that favored individuals with mutations in this region. Perhaps it was related to climate change in Africa, the shift from forest to savanna environments requiring new cognitive strategies for survival. Perhaps it was social competition, the advantages of language, abstract thought, and cultural transmission, creating a feedback loop that accelerated brain evolution. This is the standard model, supported by extensive evidence from paleontology, comparative anatomy, and genomics. Humans evolved through natural processes acting over vast timescales, but proponents of the ancient astronaut hypothesis point to this same evidence and ask different questions. Why did brain expansion occur so rapidly in evolutionary terms? Why did it begin approximately 2.5 million years ago with the genus Homo and accelerate dramatically with Homo heidelbergensis around 700,000 years ago, and again with Homo sapiens? Is natural selection sufficient to explain not just the quantitative increase in brain size, but the qualitative leap in cognitive capabilities that characterize humans? The geneticist and polymath J.B.S. Haldane once remarked that the most notable feature of the universe is that it produced a species capable of understanding the universe. Some argue this is not just notable, but improbable, requiring explanation beyond conventional evolutionary theory. Here we must mention a figure from mainstream science whose ideas, while not endorsing ancient astronauts, opened conceptual space for considering extraterrestrial involvement in the origin of life. Francis Crick, who together with James Watson and Rosalind Franklin elucidated the double helix structure of DNA, earning the Nobel Prize in 1962, later in his career became interested in the origin of life itself. In 1973, Crick co-authored a paper with chemist Leslie Orgel proposing a hypothesis they called directed panspermia. Panspermia is the general idea that life can travel between planets or even star systems, possibly seeding sterile worlds. Directed panspermia goes further, suggesting that life on Earth was deliberately sent here by an advanced extraterrestrial civilization. Crick and Orgel argued this based on several observations. The genetic code is universal. All life on Earth uses the same DNA-RNA protein system with the same 20 amino acids, which could suggest a single origin point. The complexity of even the simplest living cells is staggering, raising questions about whether life could have originated spontaneously on Earth in the time available. Certain elements essential for life, particularly molybdenum, are relatively rare on Earth but might be more abundant on other planets. Crick was careful to note this was speculative, but he found the hypothesis worth considering. In his 1981 book, Life Itself, he wrote extensively on the possibility that life was deliberately seeded on Earth billions of years ago. Crick did not suggest genetic engineering of humans specifically. His hypothesis concerned the origin of microbial life, but the conceptual framework he provided, the idea that advanced beings might intentionally spread or design life, resonates with ancient astronaut theories. In 2011, research conducted by NASA astrobiologists provided an intriguing discovery relevant to the origin of life. A team led by Michael Callahan analyzed 12 meteorites recovered from Antarctica and Australia, all classified as carbonaceous chondrites, primitive rocks dating back to the early solar system. Inside these meteorites, the researchers found adenine and guanine, two of the nucleobases that form the rungs of DNA's double helix structure. They also found related molecules and compounds so exotic, so rare on Earth, that their extraterrestrial origin was undeniable. This discovery demonstrates that the building blocks of DNA can form in space and have been delivered to Earth throughout its history via meteorite impacts. Life's ingredients, quite literally, fall from the sky. This does not prove life originated in space or was designed by intelligence, but it shows that the chemistry of life is not unique to Earth, that the universe naturally produces the molecular foundations from which life could be built. For proponents of genetic engineering hypotheses, this is significant because it establishes that biological material has cosmic distribution, that a spacefaring civilization would have access to the chemical tools needed to engineer life on a target planet. Now we must address the core question. Is there evidence in human genetics that suggests artificial manipulation? The human genome was fully sequenced in 2003, revealing approximately 3.2 billion base pairs organized into roughly 20,000 to 25,000 protein-coding genes. Surprisingly, this is not dramatically more than other organisms. The roundworm C. elegans has about 20,000 genes. What distinguishes humans is not the number of genes but their regulation, the complexity of gene expression, and critically, the presence of vast amounts of non-coding DNA. For decades, this non-coding DNA, making up approximately 98% of the genome, was called junk DNA, assumed to be evolutionary debris, remnants of viral insertions and ancient genetic duplications serving no function. This view has radically changed. Much of this non-coding DNA contains regulatory elements, switches that control when and where genes are activated. Some regions contain pseudogenes, genes that were once functional but became inactivated through mutation. Others contain transposons, sequences that can move or copy themselves to different locations in the genome. The human genome is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over multiple times, carrying the history of our evolution. But some researchers have noted anomalies, patterns that seem unusual. Human chromosome 2, for example, is unique among primates. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans all have 24 pairs of chromosomes. Humans have 23. In the 1980s, geneticists discovered that human chromosome 2 is the result of a fusion of two ancestral ape chromosomes. The evidence is clear. We can identify the telomeres normally found only at chromosome ends, in the middle of human chromosome 2, and we can identify two centromeres, the attachment points for cellular machinery that separates chromosomes during cell division, where normally there would be one. This fusion event occurred after the human lineage diverged from other great apes. Most geneticists view this as a random event, a chromosomal fusion that was not selected against and became fixed in the human population. But a small minority of researchers have speculated whether such a fundamental change could have been deliberately induced. There is no scientific evidence supporting deliberate induction, and the hypothesis faces the problem of mechanism. How would ancient genetic engineers create a chromosomal fusion in a living organism and ensure it propagated through a population? The conventional explanation that a fusion occurred in a single individual and through genetic drift or perhaps slight selective advantage spread through a small population is far more parsimonious. Yet the speculation persists, fed by the undeniable fact that chromosome fusion events are rare in evolution, and this particular fusion is unique to humans. Another genetic mystery involves the FOXP2 gene, sometimes called the language gene. Though this is an oversimplification, FOXP2 is involved in the neural circuitry that enables fine motor control of the face and larynx, critical for speech production. Humans have a variant of FOXP2 with 2 amino acid substitutions compared to chimpanzees. These substitutions are recent, emerging sometime after the human-chimp divergence. People with defective FOXP2 suffer from severe speech and language impairments. Could this gene have been modified deliberately? Again, mainstream genetics sees natural selection as sufficient explanation. Language provides enormous selective advantage. Those with better communication abilities would have had better survival and reproductive success, creating strong selective pressure, favoring mutations that enhanced language capability. But let us entertain the alternative perspective. If one were to design or upgrade a hominid to create a more intelligent, more controllable labor force, what changes would be necessary? Enhanced cognitive capacity, certainly, the expansion and reorganization of the cerebral cortex, communication ability, allowing complex instruction and coordination, modifications to vocalization, perhaps reduction in aggression, making the created beings more docile, perhaps also limitations, restrictions to ensure the created beings do not rival their creators. This brings us back to that disturbing detail mentioned earlier, the element in the ancient texts that suggests intention behind the creation's limitations. In Mesopotamian literature, there exists a recurring theme not often discussed in popular treatments of these myths. The Adapa story, recorded in fragmentary texts found at Amarna in Egypt and in Assyrian tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal, tells of a human described as created by Enki, given great wisdom, but denied eternal life. Adapa serves as a priest, described as sage-like, possessing profound knowledge, but when he is brought before the supreme god Anu in heaven, he is offered the bread and water of life, which would grant him immortality. Adapa, following instructions given to him by Enki before his ascent, refuses the bread and water. He is then returned to earth, having missed his opportunity for immortality. The text presents this as a trick. Some scholars interpret it as Enki deliberately ensuring that humans would remain mortal, subordinate to the gods. We find a striking parallel in Genesis, where Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden are permitted to eat from any tree except the tree of knowledge of good and evil. After they consume the fruit from this tree, granted knowledge, God expresses concern, stating in Genesis 3:22, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." Humanity is expelled from Eden specifically to prevent access to eternal life. These narratives share a common structure: created beings, granted intelligence but explicitly denied immortality or full parity with their creators. Conventional theological interpretation sees these as explanations for human mortality, myths that reconcile the paradox of intelligent, self-aware beings who nevertheless die. They address the existential anxiety inherent in consciousness by framing mortality as consequence of transgression or as divine decree. But if we momentarily adopt the alternative framework, if we read these as historical accounts, what do they suggest? That humanity was engineered with deliberate limitations, that we were designed to be intelligent enough to serve but not to rival, that mortality was not a punishment for disobedience, but a feature of the initial design, a biological constraint built into the species to ensure generational turnover and prevent the created from challenging the creators. Some researchers have pointed to telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes that shorten with each cell division, eventually triggering cellular senescence and contributing to aging and death. Telomere shortening is not universal in nature. Some organisms, particularly certain species capable of indefinite lifespans like the hydra or the Turritopsis dohrnii jellyfish, maintain telomere length through high activity of the enzyme telomerase. Human cells produce telomerase, but not enough to prevent telomere erosion in most tissues. Why? Conventional biology explains this as a cancer prevention mechanism. Unlimited cell division increases cancer risk, so evolution favored programmed aging in multicellular organisms as a trade-off. But could there be another explanation? Could the regulation of telomerase in humans represent a genetic limit, a biological clock deliberately set? There is no scientific evidence supporting this hypothesis, and it falls into the category of unfalsifiable speculation. We cannot distinguish between a natural evolved trait and a designed trait if the design was sophisticated enough to leave no obvious signatures. Yet the question remains philosophically intriguing. If you were creating a worker race, would you design them to be immortal? Returning to the Mesopotamian narratives, we find another crucial element: the presence of multiple factions among the Anunnaki. The texts repeatedly describe conflict between the gods, particularly between the brothers Enki and Enlil. Enki, associated with water, wisdom, and humanity's creation, is often portrayed as humanity's benefactor. Enlil, associated with air and storms, ruler of the Earth's domain, is frequently depicted as harsh, viewing humans as a nuisance. The Atrahasis epic, in its most complete form, describes a progression of events after humanity's creation. Humans multiply rapidly, becoming numerous. The text states that 1200 years after creation, the noise of humanity disturbs Enlil's sleep. He commands a plague to reduce the population. Enki intervenes, instructing humans on how to appease the gods and end the plague. The population recovers and again increases. Enlil sends a drought. Again, Enki intervenes. This cycle repeats with famine, each time Enlil attempting to control or eliminate humanity, each time Enki providing salvation. Finally, Enlil convenes the divine council and proposes a final solution, a flood to completely destroy humanity. He makes the other gods swear an oath not to warn humans. But Enki, bound by the oath not to directly tell humans, finds a loophole. He speaks to a reed wall of a house, knowing that the human Atrahasis is listening on the other side. He instructs the wall, and thereby Atrahasis, to build a boat, to seal it with bitumen, to bring aboard his family and animals. The flood comes, a deluge so terrible that even the gods are frightened by its ferocity. The text describes the gods cowering like dogs, the goddesses weeping at the destruction they have unleashed. When the waters recede, Atrahasis emerges and offers a sacrifice. The gods, having had no offerings during the flood, are hungry and gather like flies around the sacrifice. Enlil is furious that humans survived, but Enki defends his actions. The gods then establish new measures to control human population, instituting infant mortality and barrenness among women, rather than wholesale destruction. This is the Mesopotamian flood account, the prototype for the biblical Noah story, recorded centuries before Genesis was written. Mainstream scholarship views these as myth explaining natural disasters. Floods were common in Mesopotamia's river valleys. Devastating floods would have been part of collective memory, transformed into cosmic events in mythological narrative. The conflict between gods represents the conflict between natural forces, order and chaos, creation and destruction, themes universal to human experience. But Sitchin and others interpreting these texts as historical records propose a different reading. If the Anunnaki were physical beings, extraterrestrials using Earth for resource extraction, then the creation of humans as a labor force makes practical sense. The multiplication of humans, the noise disturbing Enlil, might refer to human populations spreading beyond the areas intended for them, perhaps leaving the mining regions and establishing independent settlements. The plagues and droughts might have been deliberate population control measures or engineered disasters. And the flood, in this interpretation, is the most controversial element. What could cause a global or near-global flood? Sitchin proposed that the periodic return of Nibiru, passing through the inner solar system every 3,600 years, could cause gravitational perturbations affecting Earth. He suggested that one such passage might have coincided with the end of the last ice age, approximately 13,000 years ago, that the gravitational pull could have destabilized Antarctic ice sheets, causing sudden massive melting or ice shelf collapse, resulting in catastrophic sea level rise and global flooding. Mainstream geology recognizes that sea levels did rise dramatically at the end of the Pleistocene as glaciers melted, approximately 120 meters of sea level rise over several thousand years. But this was gradual, not a sudden flood. There is no geological evidence for a single global deluge in recent history. However, evidence does exist for massive regional flooding events. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in 1997, suggests that approximately 7,600 years ago, rising Mediterranean sea levels breached a natural dam at the Bosporus, causing seawater to pour into the Black Sea Basin, which was then a freshwater lake, at significantly lower elevation. The inundation would have been catastrophic for settlements around the lake's shores, potentially drowning thousands of square kilometers in a relatively short time, perhaps months or years. This event, if it occurred, would have been within the time frame of early civilizations, potentially leaving cultural memory that entered mythological traditions. Could this be the historical kernel around which flood myths crystallized? Flood myths are indeed globally distributed, a fact that demands explanation. The Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia, Genesis from the Hebrew tradition, The Greek myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the Hindu accounts in the Puranas of Matsya, the fish avatar of Vishnu saving Manu from a flood, Chinese myths of Gun Yu and the Great Flood, the Mayan Popol Vuh describing destruction by flood, Incan traditions of Unu Pachacuti, Native American legends from dozens of tribes describing great floods, Australian Aboriginal stories of rising waters, Polynesian myths of oceanic deluge. More than 200 distinct flood myths have been catalogued from cultures across 6 continents. Conventional anthropology and comparative mythology offer several explanations for this distribution. First, many of these myths may not be independently originated, but culturally transmitted, spreading through contact between civilizations or through migrations of peoples carrying stories with them. Second, floods are common natural disasters experienced by virtually all human societies living near water sources, which most societies do because water is essential. Catastrophic local floods would be the worst disasters these societies faced, naturally becoming central to their mythological traditions. Third, the global sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age, while gradual geologically, was dramatic on human timescales, centuries of rising seas inundating coastal settlements, forcing migrations, possibly creating a deep cultural memory carried through oral tradition into the mythologies of descendant cultures. These explanations are reasonable and supported by evidence, but proponents of the ancient astronaut hypothesis argue that the specific details shared across geographically isolated flood myths are too similar to be coincidental. Many describe the flood as a divine decision to destroy humanity for wrongdoing or overpopulation. Many feature a single righteous individual or family warned in advance and instructed to build a vessel. Many specify that animals are to be saved. Many describe the survivor offering a sacrifice after the flood, which appeases the divine beings. Are these similarities due to cultural transmission, to universal human storytelling archetypes, or do they point to a single historical event, remembered by multiple cultures? The question remains open to interpretation. What is certain is that ancient peoples across the world retained stories of catastrophic floods central to their understanding of history and cosmology. Whether these stories reflect localized disasters, the glacial period sea level changes, or something else entirely, they represent a fascinating convergence of myth. This brings us to examine physical evidence, the archaeological and geological record that might support or refute these theories. Ancient astronaut proponents point to numerous structures and artifacts they argue could not have been built with the technology available at the time, suggesting either lost advanced human civilizations or extraterrestrial assistance. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built approximately 4,500 years ago during Egypt's 4th dynasty, remains one of humanity's most impressive architectural achievements. It originally stood 146.5 meters tall, constructed from approximately 3 million stone blocks averaging 2.5 tons each, with some granite blocks in the king's chamber, weighing up to 80 tons. The precision is remarkable. The base forms a square with sides approximately 230 meters long, with an average error of just 58 millimeters, less than 0.03% deviation. The sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions north, south, east, and west, with an error of approximately 3 arc minutes. The blocks are fitted so precisely that in many places a razor blade cannot fit between them. Mainstream Egyptology attributes this achievement to sophisticated engineering, large labor forces, copper and bronze tools, perhaps iron tools in limited quantity, dolerite hammerstones for dressing granite, wooden rollers and sledges for moving blocks, ramps of various configurations for raising blocks into position. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that ancient techniques could indeed shape and move large stones. The logistics were massive, requiring organization of labor, food supply, and material transport on an enormous scale. But this was within the capabilities of the centralized Egyptian state. Yet questions persist. How were the massive granite blocks quarried at Aswan, 800 kilometers away, transported to Giza? Mainstream archaeology proposes transport by boat along the Nile during flood season when water levels rose, then overland transport using sledges on moistened sand, a technique demonstrated to significantly reduce friction. How were blocks raised to great heights? Various ramp theories have been proposed. Straight ramps, spiral ramps wrapping around the pyramid, internal ramp systems. Each has engineering challenges. particularly the volume of material needed for external ramps, if they were to maintain manageable angles at great heights. In 2017, a team led by physicist Daniel Bonn at the University of Amsterdam demonstrated that wetting sand dramatically reduces the force required to pull a sledge, cutting it by up to 50%, providing experimental support for ancient depictions showing water being poured in front of sledges. Alternative theorists argue that the conventional explanations are insufficient, that the precision required for the pyramid's construction, particularly the internal chambers with their massive granite beams, and the intricate system of passages and shafts, some aligning with specific stars, suggests knowledge and capabilities beyond what 4th Dynasty Egypt should have possessed. Some propose that the Great Pyramid is far older than conventionally dated, that it predates dynastic Egypt and was built by an advanced predecessor civilization. This hypothesis faces significant challenges, primarily the absence of evidence for such a civilization and the presence of considerable evidence linking the pyramid to the 4th dynasty, including contemporary inscriptions, archaeological context of associated structures, and the overall development of pyramid construction visible in earlier attempts like the bent pyramid and step pyramid. Some alternative researchers propose that extraterrestrial assistance or advanced technology was involved, suggesting that blocks were moved using acoustic levitation or anti-gravity technology. These proposals lack any physical evidence and invoke technologies that do not exist in modern science, requiring assumption of physics unknown to us, which does not make them impossible but makes them highly speculative. Similar arguments are made for other megalithic sites worldwide. Pumapunku in Bolivia, part of a larger complex that includes Tiwanaku, features enormous stone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, cut with extreme precision. The stones are andesite and diorite, extremely hard materials difficult to work even with modern tools. Some blocks feature intricate joints and channels, suggesting advanced understanding of engineering and potentially use of tools harder than the stone itself. Mainstream archaeology dates Pumapunku to approximately 1500 years ago, built by the Tiwanaku civilization. The precision suggests sophisticated planning and possibly use of harder stones or early metal tools for shaping. But how stones weighing dozens of tons were moved without wheeled vehicles or beasts of burden, the llama cannot pull heavy loads, remains a question. Theories involving wooden rollers, ramps, leverage systems, and massive labor coordination are proposed, similar to those for Egyptian monuments. Alternative theories suggest older dates and either lost technology or extraterrestrial involvement. Easter Island's Moai, the famous stone statues, number nearly 900, carved from volcanic tuff, some standing over 10 meters tall and weighing 75 tons. How did the Rapa Nui people, occupying a remote island with limited resources and population, perhaps never exceeding 15,000, carve, move, and erect these massive statues? Mainstream archaeology provides answers. The statues were carved in a quarry using basalt tools, still found at the site, then moved using rope techniques, possibly rocking the statues forward in a walking motion as demonstrated by experimental archaeologists in 2012, or transporting them horizontally on wooden sledges, which would have required significant deforestation, consistent with pollen evidence showing the island was once forested but was largely deforested by the time of European contact, possibly contributing to the civilization's collapse. Alternative theories propose ancient astronaut involvement, pointing to a few moai with unusual features, one statue with strange carvings on its back, another with unusually large eye sockets that give it an alien appearance when shadows fall. But the vast majority of moai clearly represent human figures in the style consistent with Polynesian art traditions, and the archaeological record shows a clear developmental progression in statue carving, from earlier smaller and simpler statues to later larger and more refined ones, exactly what we would expect from a culture developing its craft over centuries. In Lebanon, the ancient site of Baalbek features Roman temples built on massive stone foundations. Within these foundations are three enormous limestone blocks known as the trilithon, each weighing approximately 800 tons. Nearby in the quarry lies an even larger block, the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighing an estimated 1,000 tons, and another called the Stone of the South, weighing approximately 1,650 tons. These are among the largest stones ever quarried and moved by humans. How were they moved? The Romans had sophisticated engineering, pulleys, winches, rollers, and the organizational capacity to mobilize massive labor forces. Moving these blocks, while extraordinarily difficult, would have been possible using these techniques, though the exact methods remain debated. Alternative researchers argue that these stones, particularly if they were cut and moved by pre-Roman civilizations, Phoenician or even earlier, would have been impossible with ancient technology, suggesting either advanced lost technology or extraterrestrial aid. The problem with this argument is that it assumes limitations on ancient people based on modern perceptions, then proposes extraordinary explanations when evidence contradicts those assumed limitations. Ancient peoples were every bit as intelligent as modern humans. They simply had different knowledge bases and technologies. Given sufficient motivation, labor, and time, they accomplished engineering feats that impress us today precisely because we do not routinely engage in such projects and have lost the accumulated practical knowledge. If you were to ask a modern engineer how to move a 1,000-ton stone without modern machinery, they would need to research and experiment, but they could develop methods, essentially rediscovering ancient techniques. This does not mean ancient achievements are not impressive, they absolutely are, but impressive does not equal impossible, and impossible without modern technology does not equal extraterrestrial intervention. Though, it should be noted, it does not definitively rule it out either. The evidence is ambiguous, subject to interpretation. What one person sees as proof of human ingenuity, another sees as evidence of anomalous capabilities requiring explanation beyond conventional history. Consider also the mystery of ancient astronomy. The Sumerians possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, tracking the movements of the Moon, the planets Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, predicting eclipses, maintaining detailed records of celestial events. They developed a sexagesimal numerical system, base 60, which we still use today in our division of time into 60 minutes and 60 seconds, and in the 360 degrees of a circle. They recognized the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of stars to shift over centuries, cycling through the zodiac constellations over approximately 26,000 years. This is a sophisticated observation requiring centuries of continuous astronomical record-keeping. Mainstream history attributes this to the Mesopotamians' interest in astrology and timekeeping for agricultural and religious purposes, driving sustained observation and recording of the heavens. Sitchin argued that Sumerian astronomical knowledge was too advanced, that their texts describe not just naked-eye planets, but all planets including those invisible without telescopes. He based this on interpretation of the Enuma Elish's cosmogony and certain cylinder seals. This claim is disputed by scholars who read Sumerian and Akkadian, including Michael Heiser, who has extensively critiqued Sitchin's translations, arguing that Sitchin mistranslated texts, misidentified pictorial elements, and made claims not supported by the actual content of the tablets. According to linguistic scholars, there is no evidence in cuneiform texts of knowledge of Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, nor of a 12th planet Nibiru, in the sense Sitchin described. The word Nibiru does appear in texts, but as an epithet for Jupiter, or sometimes for various stars, not as a separate planet beyond Pluto. The Enuma Elish's cosmogony describes mythological generation of gods, not a description of a planetary collision creating Earth. This is the academic position, and it is supported by specialists in ancient languages. However, some researchers point to other ancient astronomical anomalies. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera, dated to approximately 100 BCE, is an ancient Greek analog computer, a complex system of bronze gears that modeled the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, predicted eclipses, and tracked the Metonic calendar. When it was first studied in the early 20th century, its sophistication was so great that some believed it must be a modern contamination, that ancient Greeks could not have built such a device. But detailed analysis confirmed its ancient origin. It represents a level of mechanical engineering not seen again until medieval European clockwork centuries later. Why was this technology not more widespread? Why do we have only one example? Possibly such devices were rare, expensive, owned by wealthy patrons, and most were lost to time, with this single example preserved by accidental underwater burial that protected it from corrosion and recycling. The Antikythera mechanism proves that ancient capabilities sometimes exceeded what we expect based on the general level of technology visible in the archaeological record. It serves as a caution against underestimating ancient ingenuity. The Mayan civilization of Mesoamerica developed an extraordinarily accurate calendar system, tracking solar years, lunar months, and Venus cycles with precision. Their long count calendar, which measures time from a mythological creation date corresponding to August 11th, 3114 BCE in our calendar, operates on cycles of increasing magnitude, days, months of 20 days, years of 360 days, katuns of approximately 20 years, and baktuns of approximately 394 years. The 13th baktun ended on December 21, 2012, a date that sparked widespread speculation and doomsday predictions, none of which materialized. The Mayans themselves viewed it simply as the completion of a cycle and the beginning of a new one, not an apocalypse. The Mayans achieved this astronomical precision without telescopes, using careful naked-eye observation over centuries, building observatories like the Caracol at Chichen Itza, and maintaining detailed written records. This demonstrates what sustained observation and mathematical sophistication can achieve. Alternative theorists sometimes point to Mayan art, depicting figures in poses or with objects resembling modern technology, a famous example being the lid of Pakal the Great's sarcophagus from Palenque, which some interpret as depicting a man in a rocket ship, complete with flames below and controls in front. Mainstream archaeologists and art historians interpret this image within Mayan iconographic tradition. The figure is Pakal descending into Xibalba, the underworld, depicted falling backward onto the jaws of a skeletal earth monster, with the world tree rising above, all standard elements of Mayan afterlife symbolism. The resemblance to a rocket is pareidolia, the human tendency to see familiar patterns, especially faces or technology, in ambiguous images. But for those predisposed to see ancient astronaut evidence, the image is compelling. Who is correct? This depends on whether we interpret the image within its cultural context, using knowledge of Mayan mythology and iconographic conventions, or whether we interpret it based on superficial resemblance to modern technology. Most scholars argue that context must take precedence, that we cannot understand ancient art by projecting modern concepts onto it. But the debate illustrates a fundamental epistemological question. How do we know what we know, and when does openness to alternative interpretations become misinterpretation detached from evidence? Let us address the most challenging aspect of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, the question of Nibiru's existence. Sitchin claimed that a large planet exists in the outer solar system following a 3,600-year elliptical orbit. Modern astronomy has conducted extensive searches for trans-Neptunian objects and found many, including Pluto, Eris, Makemake, Haumea, and numerous smaller bodies. In 2016, astronomers Konstantin Batygin and Michael Brown at Caltech proposed the existence of a ninth planet, often called Planet 9, based on peculiar clustering of orbits of distant Kuiper belt objects, suggesting gravitational influence from an unseen massive body. This hypothetical planet, if it exists, would have a mass approximately 5 to 10 times that of Earth and an orbit taking 10,000 to 20,000 years to complete, far longer than Sitchin's proposed 3,600 years, and it would remain in the outer solar system, never approaching Earth. As of now, Planet 9 remains hypothetical, not directly observed. Could this be Nibiru, not in the form Sitchin described? An object as massive as Sitchin's Nibiru passing through the inner solar system every 3,600 years would cause detectable gravitational perturbations on the orbits of known planets. We would see these effects, we do not. Additionally, such an orbit would be unstable over millions of years. Interactions with Jupiter and Saturn would likely eject such a planet from the solar system or cause its orbit to change significantly. Astronomers have calculated that no large planet exists in the region and orbital configuration Sitchin proposed. This is one of the strongest scientific arguments against Sitchin's specific version of the ancient astronaut hypothesis. However, some proponents have modified the theory, suggesting perhaps Nibiru's orbit is much longer, or perhaps it is not a planet but a brown dwarf, a failed star in a distant orbit, or perhaps the Anunnaki came from another star system entirely, and Nibiru was a space station or generation ship, not a planet. These modifications make the hypothesis less falsifiable because any lack of evidence can be explained by adjusting parameters. From a scientific standpoint, this is problematic. A theory that can be endlessly modified to evade falsification does not function as a scientific theory, but from an exploratory speculative standpoint, it keeps the question alive. As we consider this, there is another mystery related to humanity's origins that conventional science acknowledges but has not fully explained. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerged approximately 300,000 years ago in Africa. For the vast majority of that time, approximately 290,000 years, human culture remained relatively static. People lived in small groups, used stone tools, hunted and gathered. Then, approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, something changed. The Neolithic Revolution occurred. Agriculture was independently developed in multiple regions around the world within a relatively short time frame. The Fertile Crescent, including Mesopotamia, the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys in China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, West Africa, possibly independently in New Guinea, and the eastern United States. Within a few thousand years, human civilization transformed from nomadic hunter-gatherer bands to settled agricultural villages, then towns, then cities. Writing was developed, first in Sumer around 3400 BCE, then independently in Egypt, China, Mesoamerica. Complex social hierarchies emerged, specialization of labor, monumental architecture, organized religion, legal codes, mathematics, astronomy. Why did this sudden acceleration occur after hundreds of thousands of years of relative stasis? Conventional anthropology points to climate change at the end of the last ice age, creating more stable environmental conditions favorable for agriculture, to population pressure requiring more intensive food production, to cultural innovations that built upon each other in a feedback loop once a critical threshold was reached. These explanations are reasonable and supported by evidence. But the rapidity of the transformation is striking. Within the span of just a few thousand years, less than 3% of the total time anatomically modern humans have existed, we went from stone tools and oral tradition to cities, writing, mathematics, and organized states. Alternative theorists ask whether this acceleration could have been influenced by external intervention, whether the Anunnaki, if they existed, might have provided knowledge, selected certain humans for accelerated cultural development, or directly manipulated genetics to enhance cognitive capabilities. This would explain both the sudden emergence of civilization and the ubiquitous myths of gods descending from the heavens to teach humanity agriculture, writing, metalworking, and other arts. In Mesopotamian tradition, the god Enki is credited as the bringer of civilization, giving humanity the me, the fundamental arts and sciences that enable civilization. In Mesoamerican tradition, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, is described as a culture hero who taught the people agriculture, writing, and calendar keeping. In ancient China, various culture heroes and semi-divine emperors are credited with teaching people agriculture, fire, medicine. In the Vedic tradition of India, the Saptarishis, 7 sages, are said to have transmitted knowledge to humanity in ancient times. These myths share a common structure. Advanced knowledge comes from divine or semi-divine beings, not from human discovery alone. Are these just expressions of human tendency to mythologize and attribute important discoveries to supernatural sources, granting them authority and sacred status? Or could they contain historical memory of actual knowledge transfer from an advanced source? We must also examine the biological evidence more carefully. As mentioned earlier, the genetic differences between humans and chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, are approximately 1–2% in protein coding regions, though when all DNA including non-coding regions is compared, similarity is approximately 98.8%. This small genetic difference produces enormous phenotypic difference, the physical and cognitive gulf between humans and chimps. Most of this difference is in gene regulation, when and where genes are expressed, not in the genes themselves. If one were to genetically engineer a new hominid species from the genetic engineering of humanity, according to Zecharia Sitchin's alternative reading of ancient texts, describes the Anunnaki selecting a primitive hominid species, possibly Homo erectus, that already inhabited Earth and altering its DNA to create Homo sapiens. This new being, Adamu, was engineered with enhanced intelligence and physical capabilities suitable for labor. Sitchin's interpretation places the Sumerian Eden as a kind of laboratory where humans were genetically modified, and he argues that biblical Eden could be a reference to this ancient biotech site. Tensions between Anunnaki leaders Enki and Enlil reflect opposing views on human empowerment, with Enki supporting the sharing of knowledge and Enlil fearing humans becoming too powerful. The Anunnaki eventually limited human lifespan by altering DNA, reducing longevity to prevent overpopulation and maintain control. Supporting this narrative are some genetic curiosities in modern humans. Human chromosome 2 is a fusion of two ancestral chromosomes absent in other primates, a unique trait that some speculate could hint at engineered intervention. Additionally, about 98% of human DNA is non-coding and still not fully understood, leaving room for speculation about hidden markers or manipulation. While mainstream science views these as natural evolutionary phenomena, proponents of the Anunnaki hypothesis see them as potential signatures of extraterrestrial genetic tampering. A 2017 study identified rapid evolution in human accelerated regions, HRs, of the genome around 600,000 to 800,000 years ago, a timing that intriguingly overlaps with the speculative period of Anunnaki genetic intervention proposed by Sitchin. While mainstream archaeology dismisses the Anunnaki as mythology, the consistency of Sumerian accounts with modern genetic anomalies challenges this dismissal, urging reconsideration of ancient narratives. A recent discovery of a 7,000-year-old clay tablet hints at advanced knowledge that could further complicate the boundary between myth and history. Despite this, the scientific consensus remains highly skeptical, emphasizing natural evolutionary processes and archaeological evidence that does not confirm extraterrestrial involvement. The debate continues, blending myth, history, science, and speculation into a captivating exploration of humanity's deepest origins.